Hey everybody. I happened to run across this from Field of Schemes in 2019, May 8th. Bill would let Oakland A's owners use tax money for Howard Terminal. Just because I said that I gave Dave Kaval the idea to use tax increment financing, rather than Neil deMause of Field and Streams, Field of Schemes, asking me why or what the objective was and having a reasoned conversation about it. He doesn't do that. He immediately seeks to discredit me, saying that I claim it. And then when I say he's being racist by trying to denounce that I did it, then he and his readers go about racially gaslighting me. Then they ask for me to prove evidence of racism. Well, your actions are racist. And my evidence of racism goes no further than the fact that you're attempting to racially gaslight me. And unless you think this is not a problem, here's a little teaching lesson for you, okay? It is a problem, and it's something you guys do a lot, and you need to stop it. This is from Healthline. How to recognize and respond to racist or racial gaslighting. Right here, okay? And it says the term gaslighting, as you might already know, refers to a particular type of emotional abuse when someone is made to question the validity of their experiences, feelings, and beliefs. When this form of manipulation is used specifically to undermine or minimize someone's experiences of racism, is called racial gaslighting. And that's exactly what Neil deMause of Field and Schemes does. And he does it a lot. Racist, okay? Racial gaslighting mostly affects people of color, according to Jason Cunningham, LMHC, a therapist at Alma. One of the earliest mentions of racial gaslighting occurs in a 2016 research paper by Professor Angelique Davis and Dr. Rose Ernst. This study highlighted the ways individual acts of racial gaslighting can contribute to white supremacy at large. Racial gaslighting can be intentional or intentional, explains Heather Lyons, a licensed psychologist and owner of the Baltimore Therapy Group. But regardless of whether someone actually intends this manipulation or not, racial gaslighting can still lead to mental and emotional harm. Learning to identify when it happens can help you handle it more effectively. Here is how to recognize racial gaslighting and what to do about it. Examples of racial gaslighting. Racial gaslighting is unfortunately very prevalent, says Dante Williams, a licensed professional counselor and CEO of the Confess Project. It happens in the education and healthcare systems, at workplaces, and in the mainstream media. The spectrum of racial gaslighting can range from direct statements like, not everything has to be about race, to subtler comments like, are you sure that's what really happened? Explains Crystal Jackson, LPC, founder and clinical director of Simply Being Wellness Counseling. A few examples of racial gaslighting in various contexts. At school, if a teacher attempts to undermine the ongoing impact of racism, that can be considered racial gaslighting, says Chantel Cargill, a licensed massage and family therapist and regional clinic director at ThriveWorks. For example, they may say something like, yes, slavery happened, but that's in the past, or we shouldn't focus on just the faults of problematic historical figures in the workplace. Say one of your colleagues repeatedly calls two Asian American employees by each other's names. When you call this out, your colleague says, I don't mean to be rude, it's just because they look so much alike, you know? This response shifts the conversation to your colleague's intention, not the impact of microaggression. Indirect or subtle discriminatory slight against members of a marginalized group. In short, Lyon says, they miss the point that these interactions can have severe emotional and professional consequences. Cargill offers another example to consider. A coworker who dismisses your experience with racism by saying something like, stop playing the race card. With friends and loved ones, maybe your partner makes a racially insensitive comment and you confront them about it, pointing out why the remark is problematic. They say, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke. That also counts as racial gaslighting, Lyon says. Racial gaslighting can also show up in friendships, according to Cargill. Maybe you have a friend who says things like, I don't see color. This misguided attitude minimizes and dismisses the racism, discrimination, and microaggressions people of color face on a regular basis in law enforcement and society at large. Video footage of George Floyd's death clearly shows a white police officer kneeling on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes while he pleaded about breathing difficulties. Williams points out, however, officers initially claimed his death was an accident. This contradicted what we had watched, said Williams. It is a clear example of a situation where reality was diminished in the context of race. Another example of racial gaslighting, the All Lives Matter movement. The racist rebuttal to the Black Lives Matter movement effectively dismisses the issue of racism, even prompting some Black Lives Matter supporters to reconsider their beliefs. What's the impact? Racial gaslighting can negatively affect your physical and mental health, not to mention your sense of identity, safety, and self-worth. As a result, it can have a far-reaching impact on your job and school performance, relationships, and other aspects of your life. A few of the potential consequences include self-doubt and eroded self-trust. When it comes to race-related microaggressions, research has found that the denial of racism, in other words, gaslighting, remains a very common theme. Researchers call this type of microaggression a micro-invalidation. In one small 2020 study, Black college students on predominantly white campuses reported numerous microaggressions. These experiences caused distress and confusion, but they also led students to question their own perceptions of events. Racial gaslighting can be harmful because you need to trust yourself to feel safe, says Jackson. As a result of racial gaslighting, you might well find it more difficult to recognize instances of racism in the future. Mental health symptoms. A 2019 review found that microaggressions may cause feelings of confusion, anger, anxiety, helplessness, hopelessness, frustration, paranoia, fear. Racial gaslighting reinforces systemic racism, thus perpetuating racial trauma that often leads to long-term effects on mental health, says Cargill. Furthermore, the accumulation of stressors such as racism, discrimination, colorism, microaggressions, intergenerational trauma, and as well as more race-related stressors may lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Wow. But experts have found plenty of other potential impacts. We get the idea. A 2014 study, including 405 young adults, found a link between racial microaggressions and thoughts of suicide by way of depression. I'm not going anywhere, folks. A 2015 study, a small one, found that Latino students who experienced racial microaggressions were more likely to experience higher levels of depression. A 2020 study included 3,320 Black Americans found that people who experienced more racial microaggressions tended to experience less general happiness and lower job satisfaction. Williams notes these effects are particularly problematic given that people of color remain notoriously underserved when it comes to mental health resources. This often makes it more difficult to assess professional support when coping with experiences of racism, racial gaslighting, or other mental and emotional health concerns. And I am not having thoughts of suicide at all, okay? Their physical health symptoms, high blood pressure, which I do have, cardiovascular conditions, respiratory conditions, and pain conditions. Perpetuating racism. And by the way, I've got a great medication for this high blood pressure. It's called exercise. Perpetuating and diet. Gaslighting and great medicine. In general, effectively keeps victims isolated and entrapped, so perpetrators can control them further. Experts say racial gaslighting similarly fuels racism. Racial gaslighting allows white groups to assuage their guilt and shirk responsibility while continuing laying blame at the feet of those privilege harms the most. The effect is a rigged, inequitable society that calls itself fair and just, Cunningham says. Racial gaslighting reinforces systemic racism, in part because it can trigger deep feelings of self-doubt. You might, for instance, catch yourself thinking, no, I must have heard that wrong, or maybe I am just too sensitive. As a result, you might feel less confident in your ability to acknowledge racism when you witness or experience it, and more hesitant when it comes to calling it out. Perhaps a coworker uses racial gaslighting to shut down your observations that in the last 5 years, only white people have received promotions at your company. Consequently, you may decide not to mention those concerns to your human resources department. It is a denial of systems of oppression that turns the conversation from creating change to creating exhaustion, says Lyons, explaining that racial gaslighting puts you in a position where you have to argue your point rather than respond or rather than work together to fight racial injustice. How to respond. Gaslighting decreases your ability to detect abuse in the future, which allows the behavior to continue. In a nutshell, that's what makes it so psychologically damaging. The first step then is coping with the harmful effects of gaslighting involve learning to recognize it. After having an experience with racial gaslighting, experts advise taking some time to check in with yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally. Trust when your body is telling you. Write it down. If you're feeling safe, if you feel safe calling someone out, the situation feels unsafe, Cunningham advises removing yourself as quickly as possible without engaging any further. But if you feel comfortable doing so, you can feel free to address the racial gaslighting and why it's harmful, Cargill says. Rather than making an accusation that might put someone on the defensive, you could start by saying, I feel like I'm not being heard when you say things like that. So why do you think you have trouble believing what I experienced and felt? That's my question to Neil deMause. And, why is it so troubling to him? This approach can be disarming because it forces the person to reflect on their unconscious assumptions and instincts. Just remember, you're in no way obligated to correct or fix someone's racial gaslighting. It's up to you to decide if you want to assist the person or educate them, says Cunningham. It's up to the privileged group to change. Even if you don't feel up to confronting that person, you may want to share your experience of racial gaslighting. Lyons suggests doing so with a trusted friend or family member, someone you know you can rely on for emotional support and validation. Quote, process the experience with people who understand and don't need education, she says. Seeking support. Finally, know that racial gaslighting could contribute to emotional distress and other symptoms, including depression, anxiety, stress, sleep issues. But you don't have to deal with these concerns alone. Cargill recommends finding a therapist, particularly another person of color who specializes in racism and trauma, who can help you process and move forward from the experience. Inclusive therapists offer a database of mental health professionals you can search and filter for. Your location, your identity, for example, Black, Latinx, or Asian, preferred especially for instances, racial trauma. Get more guidance on finding and funding therapy as a person of color, something called BetterHelp. How to avoid it. Maybe you're wondering whether you've ever been guilty of racial gaslighting yourself. It's quite possible. Read this, Neil deMause talking to you, Neil deMause at Field of Schemes. Racial gaslighting can stem from beliefs or biases you didn't know you had. So it often happens unintentionally. It can also be triggered by white fragility. In short, you might end up rejecting someone else's experiences to diminish your own guilt around racism. Quote, it's important to first reflect on why you believe your opinion is more valuable than another's, says Jackson. Self-reflection and the ability to be corrected are important if you want to avoid racial gaslighting. I would encourage you to be in a space of learning and observation, ask questions that are supportive, and take inventory of your own biases. A few additional tips. Be mindful of your thoughts. It also helps to maintain some awareness of your internal responses. When someone tells you about racism they experienced, what thoughts or feelings come up for you? If you first find yourself evaluating the credibility of the claim, this is Neil. Lyons recommends getting curious about why that is. Maybe you reject the idea because you find it too painful to imagine someone else being hurt or worry about being lumped in with the bad guy. Shift your attention to listening and getting curious, Lyons encourages. Do some research. Cargill advises getting educated on the who, what, where, when, and why of racial gaslighting, as well as its effects. The more you know about racial microaggressions and systemic racism, the greater your chances of avoiding words or actions that perpetuate racism, or at the very least, recognizing when you've made a mistake. Always stay open-minded and willing to learn about all communities and cultures, adds Williams. Never speak for others. Remember, it is not your place to decide what experiences people have or haven't had, and how they should or shouldn't feel about them, especially when you can never fully relate to that group experience. A crucial first step to promoting change is taking the lived experiences of people of color at face value. Take responsibility. It may feel very uncomfortable to accept and admit to an act of racial gaslighting, but Cargill says accountability is key. Mistakes are human, and most people mess up from time to time. The best thing you can do is acknowledge your behavior, take responsibility for it, and apologize. Then, take steps to learn from what happened so you can avoid it in the future, and then get involved. Participate in efforts to address racial inequality and injustice that can help you on your quest to educate yourself and unpack your own potential biases, in large part because it exposes you to new perspectives and solutions. One option Cargill suggests: joining a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee or a council at your school or workplace. Many employers offer diversity inclusion training, which can teach more essential skills for identifying and addressing racial inequalities and injustices like racial gaslighting. If your company doesn't offer this training, you can seek it out on your own or consider proposing it to your HR department. The bottom line: racial gaslighting downplays or outright denies the racism experienced by people of color. This type of manipulation can reinforce systemic racism by leading you to question your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. But if you feel safe calling out, you can try with an I statement about how these words made you feel, or asking questions that prompt them to reflect on their behavior. And this is by Rebecca Strong, Boston-based freelance writer covering health and wellness. Now let me get back to, again, what started all this for me. And simply, today, I happened to read this bill will let owners use tax money. This refers to what became SB 293 Skinner. And what what Neil wrongly criticized me for was simply saying that I'm the person that gave the idea to Dave Kaval. All right? So my point is, rather than try to put me down, which is what Neil did in saying that, and Dave Kaval admitted that I did do this, that I gave him the idea, he then, he says, all we know, he says, he calls this exceedingly hand-wavy, and obviously you'd want an Oakland City Hall reporter who's on the scene, or at least in the right time zone, to be asking these questions about it. He says, all we know for sure is that Zennie Abraham claims, he gave Kaval the idea for TIF last year, and I did. He says, although given that the A's owners, see, this is where he gets in gaslighting. The A's owners were talking about TIF-like structures way back in 2006. And I have that document. And see, this is where Neil doesn't ask the question, right? He assumes that, he starts off assuming that I did nothing, and then refers to this, not knowing that Dave Kaval didn't know about this, and I gave Dave the documents referring to what Let's Go Oakland did. But see, this is Neil's racism. Then he asks why I'm being racist. And then he says that I've claimed a lot of things. In other words, I should not be paid attention to. Probably best to keep several large grains of salt on half of that one as well. See, Neil's a classic racist. He's a classic, straight up racist. Okay? He is a classic, straight up racist. Pure end of story. And it goes on with, other words, and it says, I said, Neil is racist as usual. He doesn't know the history of my involvement, but seeks to discredit me because he has white supremacist issues with my being black and involved in this way in economic development in Oakland. Ask yourself why he took time to mention me. No good reason. And someone says, if this is really, see, his readers basically are also practice racial gaslighting. All right? And he says, no, it's probably upset A's fan trying, okay? So the people that he attracts, and Neil says, it's not from the same IP address as Zennie. He has no intent of apologizing. They just want to say, but sir, these accusations are everywhere. Yeah, because it's done to me, money man. I mean, Ace Fan Radio does the same thing. Okay? All right? Now, Neil says he's made it clear why he's been critical of Zennie. No, you haven't. At all. At all. In other words, okay? And he says he mentioned that from this, I'm one of the few people to write about this TIF thing, if only weirdly take credit for it. Now, what's wrong with taking credit for it? All right? And then he says, I should also note that calling someone racist gets opposed, as opposed to calling up a statement of theirs racist, which is a different thing, would normally be, massive a violation of the no personal attacks rule, but I let those slide when they're against me. And see, he doesn't try to seek understanding at all. He doubles down on his behavior. Neil has a problem. He doesn't want to be thought of as the bad guy, but then he is the bad guy. The bottom line question here is, why did I give Dave Kaval the idea, Neil? You're not even interested in that, and neither are your readers, okay? All right? And he says, sorry, I have to read this for years, and Neil has not said a racist thing, period. See, that's what, they don't even know how to recognize racism, and yet they're being racist, okay? It's disgraceful for someone to throw around these kind of charges when actual people have suffered as much under the boot of actual racism. Well, like I'm suffering it, okay? I'm pointing it out to you guys directly. You all are racist, okay? So, and here's another one. I don't think any of Zennie's predictions that weren't actually based in agreement with broader consensus are actually proven true. Okay, you mean like the one where I actually said that the, that the Raider bonds issues didn't have enough revenue coming in? Okay, right. All right. And then he talks, see, this is like a lot of time spent simply trying to credit me, all right? And said that I called Deadspin racist, and they were, because they allowed the dudes from Joe Morgan to guess to run the site, to fire Joe Morgan. What? Because Joe Morgan is black. And that's not the only thing Deadspin has done. They took one of my videos, didn't even report it for me. So yeah, that was racist. All right, so this is like doubling down on racial gaslighting from these folks. I mean, these people are racist, okay? I love the image of Zennie talking to a billionaire, telling him about some clever financing move the rich guy and his people never heard of before. And see, this is Jeff being racial gaslighting too. They have a real problem with this. It reminds me of a classic Gilbert where a disheveled guy, listen to this, a disheveled guy is writing a huge equation on a chalkboard and then says, and the equation explains how can be an expert on finance but still dressed like a flood victim, okay? So all these are racist. Neil is a racist guy. He's straight up racist. He attracts people who have racist ideas. And so, and he spent all that time putting me down rather than asking a simple question, which could have led to a great technical discussion. This is an example of racism, folks. Period, end of story. And I'm not taking this laying down. I'm fighting back. Heck with you all, including you, Ace Fan Radio, who does the same thing. Y'all are racist. Subscribe to Zennie62 and bookmark oaklandnewsnowblog.com and stop doing this crap.